Well, thank you, Joaquin, for the introduction. Thank you to the Central Bank for the invitation, especially the organizers. As Joaquin has mentioned, I've been associated with this conference now for a number of years, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be here. And I commend and I thank the Central Bank of Chile for having this initiative. I find that I've been now in this game for almost 3 decades, and it's very hard to find this kind of forum that actually connects policy and academia in such an effective and important way as these conferences that actually are celebrating now their 21st version. And when I was approached to talk about I write a paper for the conference, I immediately thought about a topic that I wanted to discuss. I've been trying to actually work on for some time, related to some work that I did recently on unconventional monetary policy in emerging economies. And the topic of foreign exchange intervention actually is quite curious, because it's clearly the case that there is hardly any topic in international macroeconomics where there's more of a difference between academic research and policy making. Okay? So academic researchers, for example, have tried to find, without success, much empirical evidence for the contention that sterilized foreign exchange intervention is effective as a policy tool. Right? I mean, there is, I think that's actually quite fair to say. People have looked quite hard, but the results have been quite disappointing. Right? And I can expand on this if necessary, but I think that we should actually notice that in spite of multiple attempts at finding consistent evidence, the evidence has been elusive. And now, when you think about the theory, then this is not a surprise in a sense, right? Why? Because we have a well-developed set of results. Especially, there has been this very influential paper by Bacchus and Quijo that actually convinced the field for a number of years that under a wide range of circumstances, including a lot of the models that actually are dominant in macroeconomic research, sterilized intervention should be neutral. Right? In comparison, central bankers ignore us. Right? And they do intervene frequently and vigorously, and they also believe that they actually are doing something that is effective and welfare improving. Right? I mean, that actually is the case both when you look at the data and you actually ask central bankers what they believe about intervention. Just to look at the data, just to celebrate the Peruvian win in the World Cup, I have the data for Peru, and you can see that in recent years, especially after in the last 10 years, Peru has intervened in both directions quite vigorously. Right? I mean, these numbers are in the order of sometimes $400 million, for example, in a day. Right? I mean, this data actually comes courtesy of Paul Castillo, who is here. Now, just to give you another sense of the importance of intervention, there has been, for example, a bunch of papers coming mostly from the International Monetary Fund. In particular, there is a very useful paper by Adler and Tobar that actually looked at the experience after 2005 and right before the global crisis. And they actually looked at intervention to essentially accumulate reserves. And they found that for Latin American countries, central bankers were intervening about 19% of the time, and in the period, the cumulative intervention was of the order of 10% of GDP. Right? I mean, there was some variation. I mean, Peru, for example, turns out to be quite active, intervening 39% of the time, and having actually accumulated more than 1/3 of GDP in reserves. But there is also not only in Latin America, but in other countries, the observations are that intervention has been quite prevalent. So what do we do about this? That's the question that this paper is trying to answer. And in order to do that, what I do in the paper is to actually extend or develop a recent perspective on intervention that is, I hope, going to actually go a substantial way towards reconciling the academic and policy perspectives. Right? And the starting point is the recognition that sterilized intervention should be considered as one more of a bunch of policies that have become prominent recently in research, what are called, I guess, unconventional central bank policies. And that's a point that I made in a couple of papers with Andrés Velasco and Lucho Céspedes recently. Right? So once you recognize that, then there are two obvious steps that you have to take. One is to recognize that you have to make some assumptions to allow for intervention, sterilized intervention that is, to be non-neutral, at least under some circumstances. So in our viewpoint, the most promising avenue is to allow that there are some financial frictions that impinge in the economy's ability to obtain credit from abroad. So that's going to be one ingredient of the paper. But also, we actually want to allow for or try to be consistent with the empirical evidence and also our priors about how intervention works. I mean, our priors are going to be that intervention works sometimes and not others, right? And the way to think about this problem effectively, I find, is that to model debt limits as binding only occasionally. So that actually takes us to the kind of literature that has been popularized by people like Enrique Mendoza and others, right? And that's actually a literature that I'm trying to also take advantage of in this work. Okay. So once you take that perspective, then we are led to a very different way, to a very different perspective about intervention relative to what you get, for example, in textbooks in the literature. For example, or classic treatments, and even a more recent literature that I'm going to actually comment on, right? But the starting point is just to recognize that, if you look at typical central bank balance sheet, actually, intervention, sterilized intervention that is, involves changing only the asset side, right? So, for example, a sale of reserves actually means that, for sterilization, the central bank usually is going to compensate with movements in the net credit part, right? So, for example, if the central bank buys dollars, say, in Chile, then somehow, in order to sterilize this operation, the central bank typically is going to reduce net credit to the private sector, right? I mean, this in the paper, for example, and in practice, I'm going to confine to a particular instrument, which was what has been called sometimes a sterilization bond. So the central bank actually borrows sometimes to buy reserves. Now, let's actually think about the circumstances under such a movement. Such a move is neutral, right? And in the Bacchus-Quijo kind of world, right, sterilized intervention is going to actually is going to be translated into, say, compensated movements in other financial flows. For example, in the model of this paper, if there are no financial frictions, then domestic banks are going to actually finance the government, right? They are going to take the sterilization bonds and borrow an offsetting amount in the world market. And that's going to be that, right? I mean, the credit, in particular, credit flows to the private sector do not have to change, right? But if you actually allow for the fact that these domestic banks may actually have limits in their ability to borrow from abroad, then sterilization actually involves that maybe domestic banks are actually going to be limited in their ability to finance the government in their purchase of reserves, right? And therefore, sterilization actually ends up crowding out domestic loans. So that's the whole idea of the paper, right? That the impact under some circumstances of sterilized foreign exchange intervention is about the impact of the sterilizing credit on the international credit limits that this economy actually faces, right? Now, this is the same argument that actually we developed with Velasco and Céspedes in a couple of papers. It's actually the same argument that has been developed. It's very similar to an argument that has been developed by other papers of very recent vintage. In particular, there's a bunch of papers by Benesberg, Portillo and Babra, Vargas, González and Rodriguez, Cavallino, Montoro and Ortiz, etc. That actually I do recommend. They are very nice papers. One difference, however, that turns out to be crucial between my paper and their paper is that in these other contributions, actually, financial frictions actually bite all of the time, right? I mean, they assume that financial intermediation is subject to some kind of financial technology. That means that, for example, assets in domestic currency and foreign currency actually are imperfect substitutes, right? And that actually is the reason in their models why sterilized intervention actually may work. Just to appreciate, how different this kind of view is relative to the one that I'm advancing in this paper. Well, the treatment that I'm going to give today is actually much simpler and actually clarifies what is truly essential about this mechanism. Right? For example, in the model that I'm going to describe, then we're going to assume that there's no imperfect substitutability of assets. All assets are perfectly substituted. In fact, it's not even necessary to allow that there are differences in currency denomination. In fact, I'm going to develop much of my argument in an economy in which all assets are denominated in dollars, right? And that doesn't mean, of course, that these features of the economy are not important. I mean, they can interact with the sterilization mechanism, but they are not essential to understand how sterilized foreign exchange intervention works. Of course, this argument is not about policy signaling. On the other hand, it does depend on the particular features of the economy in terms of, for example, the financial frictions and institutions that actually characterize the economy, which is to me, a very, very attractive aspect of the formulation, right? Because, for example, it may be the case that the impact of sterilized intervention actually depends not only on whether financial frictions are binding, but also on what kind of economy we're talking about, right? And also, I'm going to actually show or argue that this kind of view about intervention has a very close connection with other problems that turn out to be quite interesting from the viewpoint of theory and also from the viewpoint of policy, although we don't understand them very well. In particular, the problem of what are the costs and benefits of reserves accumulation, for example, and what is the role of what has been called the quasi-fiscal deficits of the central bank. Okay? All right. So before seeing the model, let me just give you a preview of what we can learn from this kind of discussion. First of all, I'm going to actually set up a model with occasionally binding constraints. And I'm going to actually show that in that model, financial foreign exchange intervention is effective if and only if it happens at times of binding financial constraints, or it makes financial constraints that wouldn't bind to be binding, right? I mean, that actually turns out to be a version, in fact, of the theorems, the same theorems that Backus and Quijo popularized. But what is different about my paper is that I go beyond that work and I show what happens when these financial constraints might actually bind and sterilized intervention may actually be important. Now, in this model, we find that sterilized intervention actually is related to the question of accumulation of reserves. And I'm going to argue that the model actually gives me an interesting trade-off that related to having accumulating reserves. In the model, as you might guess from my description, then the central bank needs reserves in order to deal with the possibility that financial constraints might turn suddenly binding. But the question is, well, what is the cost of accumulating reserves? Well, in this model, because the central bank is financing reserves with sterilization bonds, then high reserves actually means that it's the economy, when financial constraints do not bind, the economy is closer to the credit limit. So in that sense, the economy actually, the central bank that is holding more reserves is actually making the economy more vulnerable to prospective shocks. Okay? So that's a trade-off. And I think it's a new observation in the literature and very different from the kind of considerations that have actually governed or dominated the discussion about reserves in other papers. In fact, in the paper, I show that accumulation of reserves can be excessive and lead to a credit crunch. Right? Now, the analysis also focuses on some foreign exchange intervention rules. I mean, the kind of model that I'm going to discuss, then you might ask the question, well, what happens if the central bank, for example, buys reserves when the exchange rate is strong and sells reserves when the exchange rate is weak. Something that actually has been proposed. And actually, the model gives us interesting implications about that. I mean, if the exchange rate is weak, then it turns out that sometimes it will be actually welfare improving. It's going to be a good idea for central bank to sell reserves. Right? But on the other hand, in this model, there is no particular reason why the central bank should be buying reserves when the financial constraints are not binding. So this kind of policy is in fact dominated in my model by a policy of intervention in response to credit spreads. Why? Because credit spreads in the economy are going to signal when financial constraints are binding or not. Finally, the paper actually focuses on the question of whether sterilized intervention should be considered to be an independent monetary tool. And the answer is yes, but it's yes in a different way from what you might have heard from other papers in literature. Because why am I saying this? Because, you know, if I assume that, for example, the non-stochastic steady state is one such that financial constraints do not bind, then in a linear approximation, in a local approximation of the model around that steady state, then intervention is going to be irrelevant. So in order to understand in what way intervention can be considered an independent instrument, you have to look at the global solution, and therefore you have to look, you have to be careful in taking non-linearities into account. Okay? So, as I said, the answer of whether intervention should be considered to be an independent tool of monetary policy, the answer is yes, but it's yes in a particular way. It's not just it's very different from the way that other papers have approached the question. Okay. So let's go to the essentials of the model. Okay. It's actually a very simple model, and in fact, you know, I make it as simple as I can in order to bring the main points into stage for view. I mean, we look at a simple economy that lives forever, a small open economy. There are two traded goods: one that is produced at home, one that is imported. Yeah, the imported good is fixed at one in terms of an international currency. Domestic consumption is going to be an aggregate of home goods and imports. Okay, so the CPI PT in terms of the domestic currency pesos is given by some combination of the price of home goods, which is PHT, and the exchange rate, the nominal exchange rate E. So the model is actually quite standard in a number of ways, right? The more important part of this setting of goods markets and so on is the discussion of aggregate demand. So domestic output, the demand for domestic output is given by domestic demand, home demand for domestic output, and foreign demand. So if I define the real exchange rate to be the relative price of imports to the home output, then domestic output is just the first term in the right-hand side is just home demand for the home good, and then the last term is just foreign demand for the home good. So, intuitively, demand for output increases with consumption, total consumption, and also increases with the real, when the real exchange rate becomes weaker, so with a depreciation. So that's actually quite standard. Production is going to be also standard. Actually, for much of the paper, I'm going to assume that there are no nominal rigidities. I do introduce nominal rigidities at some point, but let's assume for now that there are no nominal rigidities. However, to set the stage, I just assume that there's monopolistic competition in the goods market. So the home good is just an aggregate of varieties, and you can actually derive the typical markup rule, for example, for pricing. So these are all standard. What actually turns out to be key is the specification of financial flow. So this is actually a diagram that tells me how flows actually happen in this economy, right? I mean, at the heart of the, at the center of flows are domestic banks. Domestic banks actually borrow from the rest of the world at some interest rate R star, right? The debt of domestic banks is given by DT, right? And banks are going to be lending domestically to household or the central bank, right? The central bank may borrow because the central bank wants to accumulate reserves. So in this very simple treatment, the central bank buys reserves by issuing sterilization bonds, or sterilization bonds. So FT is the amount of reserves, is equal to BT is the amount of bonds. So there's no reason to differentiate between the two, right? And I assume that bonds actually are, from the viewpoint of domestic banks, are perfect substitutes relative to domestic loans to households, right? So those domestic bonds, sterilization bonds or household loans actually are carrying interest rate that this letter is bar phi t, right? Which may or may not be equal to the world interest rate, R star, right? Of course, anticipating what happens, the spread, the difference between 1 plus bar phi minus R star is positive if financial constraints bind. Okay? Now, I'm going to assume that the amount that banks can borrow is limited by a fraction of what we call in the paper equity. That's actually in the middle of the triangle. dt is less than or equal to a number, theta, times k. And k is actually, equity that households hold in banks. Okay? So that's the setting of the model. And so the other slides actually just describe exactly what I said, right? So banks borrow subject to a credit limit. So the debt of the bank's dt is less than or equal to theta, the equity that they obtain from households, right? And then when you look at the problem of the banks, essentially you obtain what you would expect. Okay? That is, if the rate of interest on domestic loans and sterilization bonds is greater than the world interest rate, then banks are going to want to lend as much as they can. So the debt constraint is going to bind. Okay? On the other hand, if the rate of interest on domestic loans is equal to the world interest rate, then banks are going to actually be willing to lend, borrow and lend as much as they, any quantity, as long as, and that's going to be feasible if the debt constraint is satisfied. Okay? Now, what we have to emphasize is the description of what sterilized intervention is in this model, right? So, as I said, the assumption is going to be that central bank buys or sells dollars, the international currency, by issuing or retiring central bank bonds that I call, sterilization bonds, right? Now, this is not only a convenient device. In fact, it is realistic. I mean, several countries had used this kind of sterilization bonds to sterilize foreign exchange intervention, right? But also, it's equivalent to a lot of other settings that you might imagine, right? So I'm not going to actually dwell too much on this. The thing that the assumption that is actually more important for some purposes is the assumption that official reserves cannot be negative, right? So this is the assumption that we are in a small country, like Peru, that cannot issue international currency. Okay? Incidentally, this setting is essentially the same as in other papers in the literature. So, I'm not going to be too apologetic about this. What is actually crucial, however, is that these sterilization bonds are actually financed by domestic banks, right? And domestic banks are subject to the external credit limit, right? So you actually need some assumption like this, right, in order for, I guess, to make some progress on the question, in my view, right? I mean, that some fraction of the sterilization bonds that are issued by the central bank, when the central bank, say, buys reserves, actually, essentially is taking up some of the credit limit that domestic banks can actually have access to in the world economy. Okay. There's another interesting twist in this model, which is what the central bank does with the reserves, and that actually, I impose two usual assumptions in the literature, right? The central bank, for example, is assumed to invest official reserves at the external interest rate R star. But actually that means that under some conditions, especially when spreads are positive, the central bank is going to make actually losses in its foreign exchange operations, right? So I'm going to assume, as in the literature, that these losses are financed with some lump sum tax on households, right? So the idea is that, well, the government actually imposes taxes on households and finances the central bank losses if they actually exist. Now, obviously, for a number of countries, this is actually not an obvious assumption. In fact, Chile is a good example in which quasi-fiscal deficits turn out to be a crucial question. Right? So I'm going to leave it at this point, but just note at this point that this is actually a key part of a key assumption that we had to make in order to make progress on the question. Okay, so the household side is actually quite standard. The non-standard part is the household can borrow, right, from banks, but also are going to hold equity, right? So we assume that there are some domestic distortions that mean that the equity the household can hold in banks is limited by some number K tilde in the slide, okay? So actually that's quite convenient because that actually means that that constraint turns out to be binding when the debt external constraint is binding as well. Okay? Intuitively, the reason is that when the both constraints are going to be binding when the spread is positive, right? So there's no loss of generality, in fact, in this model to assume that equity is always equal to K tilde in this model. So I'm going to just forget about that part for a while. The other part that actually turns out to be useful in my formulation is that to assume that households actually, in addition in addition to income from, say, working, right, they also get an endowment income. I mean, think of an economy like Peru or Chile that gets endowment from some commodity resource, right? So I'm just going to assume that there is an stochastic resource there that actually is going to be the main source of shocks in this economy. So this is actually going to allow me to see how this model works. Okay. There's one more twist in this model that actually one has to deal with the fact that I'm going to assume that in the non-stochastic steady state, the financial constraints do not bind. But then if that's going to give me a well-defined steady state, then I have to make some assumptions about, for example, in the spirit of, say, Schmidt-Uribe's famous paper on closing small economy models. So I just assume that the interest rate R star is actually depends on the amount of credit that banks give to domestic households. Okay, so that's the model, right? And to close the model, what we need to do is to actually think about how foreign exchange intervention is defined. Okay? And that's actually what the paper is about. So the first result is essentially a version of Backus and Quijo. Foreign exchange intervention actually affects equilibria if and only if it affects binding financial constraints or makes the constraints bind in state of nature in which they would have not. Right? As I said, this is actually similar to the Backus and Quijo result. But in contrast to Backus and Quijo, in this model, I can explore what happens if foreign exchange intervention does matter. I mean, Backus and Quijo actually stopped their analysis saying, well, if foreign exchange intervention matters, then we cannot say how it matters because we have to specify fiscal policy. In fact, this is actually, for example, where the quasi-fiscal deficit assumption matters, right? Because that actually amounts to a complete specification of fiscal policy, and then that's actually why I can go beyond just the observation that foreign exchange intervention matters. Okay, so this is so how does intervention work in this model? Well, now you should be able to see how it's going to work. If collateral constraints bind, then the central bank, when the central bank sells reserves, then it also reduces or cancels sterilization bonds, right? But now, domestic banks have an incentive to take these additional resources and lend those resources to the private sector. So in that sense, foreign exchange intervention relaxes the financial constraints, but only it can do so when they bind. Okay? Of course, in order for the central bank to do that, then it has to have enough reserves. So this can be seen in this model as a benefit of reserves accumulation. On the other hand, when financial constraints do not bind, then if the central bank is maintaining a large amount of resources, then it's taking up some of the credit limit in this economy. So it's actually placing the economy closer to the debt limit, and it's making the economy more vulnerable to external shocks. Right? So that's the trade-off on reserves accumulation that I was alluding to before. One thing that actually this model actually yields is a very different view of why exchange rate matters. I mean, what determines exchange rate movements in response to intervention. And the reason why exchange rates move here is that exchange rates are an important determinant of the consumption saving decisions of the representative households, especially when the economy is deconstrained. Then, for example, the domestic market has to adjust, and the interest rate on loans has to adjust. The consumption interest rate on loans has to adjust in order to ensure that consumption adjusts consistently with the debt constraint. Okay, so the interest rate, the appropriate interest rate, is not only given by the interest rate, the dollar interest rate on loans, but also by a function of expected depreciation.
Roberto, I can see that you are just beyond the first half of the presentation. We have like 5 minutes.
Yeah. All right. So, but the rest can be very fast. I mean, this is actually a depiction of how the economy, for example, works, responds to a fall in the endowment of dollars. I mean, here, the green dotted line is what would happen if there were no financial constraints, right? I mean, then if the dollar endowment falls, then the representative agent would borrow more, and that would be essentially that. I mean, there's very little movement about that. Now, this fall in dollars, in the endowment of dollars, is large enough that under financial constraints, the debt limit is actually reached. I mean, that's the upper left corner, right? And therefore, consumption has to fall, right? In order to actually effect that change in consumption, then the exchange rate depreciates and the interest rate on loans has to increase. So that's the adjustment process to a fall in the endowment of dollars. Now, I consider, for example, what happens when you have a simple intervention policy, for example, where, say, the amount of intervention in central bank bonds is just a stochastic process, right? And you can see that in this model, small changes in intervention do not affect real allocations in general, right? Now, large changes in intervention have asymmetric results. A large sale of reserves, for example, exhausts the reserves of the central bank. But a large enough purchase of reserves actually brings the economy to a constrained region. So in that sense, the central bank can, in fact, effect, by buying reserves, the central bank can actually bring the economy to a constrained region and can actually effect a depreciation of the currency, right? But what is really happening is that the central bank is engineering a credit crunch. Okay, so now in this model you can ask, well, what happens when you have rules by which, say, intervention depends on, say, the exchange rate? And in this model, as I said, if financial constraints bind, then if the central bank sells reserves when the financial constraints binds, then that's beneficial because that relaxes the credit constraints. But this kind of policy has the disadvantage that it actually implies the central bank is also intervening when there's no need to, right? A superior policy here is a policy that depends on the credit spread, right? Because if the central bank reacts to the credit spread, then it's only going to intervene when actually financial constraints bind. Okay, so I'm essentially out of time, but the rest of the paper essentially is trying to give the idea that, first of all, these results do not depend on the particular assumptions that actually I have made with respect, for example, the fact that the economy is financially dollarized and there are no nominal rigidities. In fact, you can introduce them and that's actually not, that doesn't change my main results. What actually is interesting is that the model allows us to, say, now understand the interaction between monetary policy and intervention with the results that I already mentioned, so I'm not going to repeat them. Okay, I have 6 seconds, and let me just conclude then. You can read the paper. It's a nice paper. So how does the model actually allow us to reconcile theory and evidence? Well, first of all, the model is such that much of the time intervention is not going to actually have any effects in the economy, right? So in that sense, the model is more promising as an explanation of the empirical evidence than other models. On the other hand, by the same token, it actually gives us a rationale for properly timed sterilized foreign exchange intervention. In fact, here I have stressed the fact that when financial constraints bind, then it is in fact proper for the central bank to try to intervene, right, and sell foreign exchange. But intuitively, what is happening is that the central bank, by selling foreign exchange, is relaxing the financial constraints that are actually binding in this economy. And of course, there is a lot of much more research that is actually warranted at this point. For example, I haven't talked about macroprudential issues or optimal policy, but these actually are questions that emerge naturally, right? And obviously, there are questions related to what I mentioned about the quasi-fiscal policy of the central bank and empirical issues. Thank you very much.